Welcome to Public Speaking with Peter George. Do you want to be calm, confident, and credible every time you speak in public? Then stay tuned as Peter and his guests discuss public speaking tips, techniques, and tactics that help you increase your impact, influence, and income. Here's your host, Peter George.
Where are you on your journey in public speaking? Are you just starting out? Are you hitting your stride? Are you ready to further refine your skills so you can craft and deliver even more engaging and more compelling talks? No matter where you are, listen in as Robert White describes his journey, complete with trials and triumphs. What he has to share just might resonate with you and give you that boost of encouragement you've been looking for. Here's a little bit about Robert. With over 1.3 million graduates from high-impact experiential training in companies he's founded and led, Robert has been there and done that. He's lived and worked abroad in Japan, Hong Kong, and mainland China for a total of 21 years. He's a mentor to executives, a serial entrepreneur, trainer of thousands, author of a bestseller, and of course, a public speaker. I'm so happy Robert's here to join us today, and here's my chat with him. Welcome to the show, Robert.
Well, thank you. It's great to be with you, Peter. It's taken us a long time to coordinate schedules and do this, and I'm delighted.
I'm glad you're here. Robert, for every speaker, there's a story about how they got into public speaking. How did you get into it?
Well, part of my story, I guess, Peter, is that at 17, I had the highest rated top 40 radio show in the state of Wisconsin. I made more money than my father ever made and had a certain amount of acceptance at school, which at that age is very, very important. And in that same year, I got a C in speech in high school. I found out, a little bit of self-learning there. I learned that in a booth, speaking to a microphone and imagining my teenage audience was easy for me, and I really loved it. I just totally enjoyed it. At the same time, I could not stand up in front of 22 students in my speech class and talk. When I look back on my life and significant events, that was a turning point for me because it started kind of an exploration. What was it about me such that I couldn't be in front of people, real people, and effectively speak? So that was kind of my beginning. A second thing that happened was years later in a little sales business that I was horribly unprepared for and psychologically unfit for. I'm a pretty extreme introvert. We were doing these sales presentations, and they consisted of a 5-minute introduction to a speaker. And then the speaker would give a 30-minute word-for-word talk to convince people to join this company. It was a recruiting talk. And I was living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin at that time, and we were driving actually up to Green Bay. You and I chatted about our mutual experiences of Green Bay. And so I was prepared to do my little 5 minutes, with knees knocking, shaking, nervous, but I could do that 5-minute introduction. And the guy driving the car was going to do the 30 minutes. And so he was listening on a cassette tape to that 30-minute program, kind of reminding himself or practicing it. And I found myself kind of mouthing the words to it as it went on. And he later told me that from that, he knew that I knew the talk. And he also knew that I was very carefully avoiding giving that talk. Again, being face-to-face with people. So we got up to the thing and, you greet people, you shake hands and handle registration and suggest seating and all that kind of busyness. And then he walked up in front and did the 5 minutes.
So it was trial by fire.
Yeah, introduced me. So those were kind of early experiences for me. But I found that I don't want to, treat you as my therapist, except, maybe it's needed, still needed. But maybe it would require a couch and a therapist to fully explain me and my reluctance in front of a room that I've worked to overcome over all of these years. But I learned in a very conscious way how to be effective in front of a room. Because of that, I've also been able to help some other people I love what you do because I think there's just so many really bad public speakers out there. So I love the work that you do because you can help the people that, like I was in my 20s, kind of really stumbling through life.
I have a lot of fun helping those people too, because it does ultimately make a difference in their career and possibly their entire lives.
I'm surprised to learn how many people really have a need to be better public speakers, but that the number of public speaking opportunities is huge. I mean, the obvious one are these really highly paid, very, very skilled people that speak to hundreds and thousands of people. But I've learned that, like in the financial services industry, there are people that do 4 or 5 talks at lunch or at brunch or at breakfast every week, week after week after week. It's their job to do these little presentations. And then, of course, there's the classic person that's asked to speak at the wedding or at the club or before the city council. It's a huge opportunity for people, and it's a huge issue for many people. Some because of, like me, the kind of psychological underpinnings of that, but also just skills, just an ability to connect and communicate and persuade people.
What I've learned over the years, Robert, is a lot of people, when you talk about getting better skilled at public speaking, they respond with, hey, I've got the guts to get up there and I know what I want to say. I'm all set. And they don't realize that they're just vomiting information on people. They're not communicating with them. They're not having those people in the audience willingly open their minds so they can sync their minds with them and give a benefit to those people to take away with them. They just see it as, no, I can get up there and do it. I'm good.
Well, I was not that confident. I was kind of the opposite on that particular continuum, but the result's the same in that being ineffective. 2 weeks ago, I went to a venerable and very famous, reputable country club here in town and to listen to a speech and have dinner. And the speaker was an architect talking about how the city centers, park and government buildings and that whole plan, how it came together over 50 years. And so I'm like, I don't know anything about architecture, but I'm fascinated with it, how people create it. And so his content was fantastic, and he was an absolutely horrible speaker, but his content was so good. And I thought, wow, he would really benefit from a session with Peter. He was terrible, but the content was so good that I enjoyed it anyway. So I think that that can happen. Your content can be so good that the fact that you are presenting it badly gets swept under the rug somewhat.
And no one wants to come up and tell you that you're not a good presenter.
Ooh, boy, that's true. That's true. Well, I really enjoyed you tonight. Can you sign my book or whatever?
Exactly. I tell all my clients that if someone comes up, and you got to take this with a grain of salt, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, great job, it probably wasn't. If they can't come up with something more intelligent to say than great job, as in, I didn't know that fact and I'm glad I know now, or I'm going to take this away and implement it. If all they got is great job, yeah, you didn't give them the much. They're just being polite.
Years ago, I heard this, and I don't know the source of it. I learned it from Wilson Learning, the Minneapolis company that does sales training and management trainings, things like that. So I don't think they originated it, but it was the stages of competence. I don't know if that's familiar to you, but that the lowest level is unconscious incompetent. You don't know how to do something, but you're pretty blind to it. You're unconscious about it. And then the stage up from that is you find out that you're incompetent. You become a conscious incompetent, which is a good kickoff place for learning, of course. And then the next level is you become a conscious competent. And then the highest level, supposedly, is an unconscious competent. And there are people that get up in front of a room and are just magical with zero training. They're just great. And I think it's a very small percentage, but it does exist. I'm a conscious competent. I had to learn a few things.
Same here.
And that I use kind of as in computer terms, your operating system, right? I kind of have a few things in the background that I try to follow. that really helps me because I'm not an unconscious competent. And I know that about myself. That's been part of my journey is learning a little bit about structuring a speech, a little bit about delivery, a little bit about what works. And, we can learn that from people like you or by studying Winston Churchill or, Ronald Reagan I remember the first person where I looked at him and I thought, he's so natural appearing and this is not natural. He learned this.
Oh, yeah. It's a learned skill. And even the people who seem like the natural speakers, they just get up there. They didn't take any training. I still think in one way or another, they were trained, whether it's what they witnessed at home, what they were exposed to in school, someone took them aside and helped them, whatever it might be. For the most part, it's a learned skill. Now, are there people who just come out of the womb as a great speaker? Well, I'm sure there are, just like there are 2-year-olds who can play Mozart without ever having seen a piano before. That's just something that happens in this world for some unexplained reason. But for the most people, it's a learned skill. And I think anybody can learn it.
Well, of course, that improves your market for your work, Peter. So I understand that belief.
Sure, I can help you.
I traveled a lot years ago internationally, or I guess I still have, but to Europe. And I was in London many, many, many times back in the days when there were very few direct flights. You had to go into London and then into the continent. And I had a friend living in London, so I would structure my trip to spend a day or two with him, partially to handle jet lag and partially because I enjoyed having fun with him. But something I never did was I was never a tourist. So 2 years ago, I spent a week just before the COVID lockdown came. I spent a week in London alone and with no agenda other than being a tourist. And part of that is I spent an entire day in those offices, those wartime World War II offices beneath Parliament, where they ran the government during the Blitz, during the bombing of London. And that includes the Churchill Museum. I had been a big fan of Churchill before that, and I had actually studied some of his speeches. But that in that day, I found out that Churchill had an outline that he followed for almost all of his public speaking, and which was, what gets the attention is that it's probably an example of one man's speaking that saved a nation, in its truly darkest time.
Definitely.
Bombing every day and people living in bomb shelters and all of that stuff. But I learned his outline, and since then I've actually started structuring any opportunity that I have to speak around his structure, and I found it to be really useful.
It's a great example. Not too bad to follow Winston Churchill.
Good point.
Is there anything else you deal with that you work on to become a more effective speaker?
I've learned a few things, and one of them is beginning with physical. Is that I jump up and down and I get physically active backstage before I speak. I act out a little bit. And for an introvert, actually, that part is a bit difficult because you're kind of making a fool of yourself in front of a limited audience, usually of 2 or 3 people. But I start with, and even before that, I think some level of physical fitness is important. Stretching, exercise, getting the blood moving. But right before a speech, one of the things I do is I do jump up and down and act a little bit crazy and project myself out there, which is for an introvert is challenging, but I found it's necessary. People didn't come to your talk to be bored.
No, they didn't.
You better be a little bit entertaining. The second piece of it is more personal, is to remind myself to be a little more vulnerable personally. To open up a little bit more on a personal level. I'm a big fan of the late Buckminster Fuller, as a thinker, as a brilliant inventor, a brilliant philosopher. I mean, the list of that guy's human qualities goes on and on and on. And years ago, I heard him speak in Tokyo, and I was like that expression of fanboy. I was a fanboy. I bought the tickets when they came out. That it was at the Tokyo American Club. I arrived early. I sat in the front row. It's almost embarrassing, But I was so thrilled to be able to meet this. And at that time, he was in his 80s and frail, kind of had to be helped a little bit to the stage. But it was just a thrill for me. And I'd read all his books, and I'd gone to the Chicago Museum of Natural History and seen the Dymaxion car that he invented. I was a fanboy, and he got this introduction. It was one of those introductions where, there's a fear that the introduction is going to be longer than the speech. His accomplishments were legion, and that introducer talked about all of them. So they helped Bucky to the stage. And the first words out of his mouth were, the most special thing about me is that I'm an average person. Now, later, studying Churchill, studying neurolinguistic programming, I found that sentence was consistent with all of that teaching, which is build rapport with the audience. Take yourself down a peg or two, or maybe three, and let them know that you are like them. When a guy like Bucky Fuller says, I started out as I am an average person, that was shocking to me. And I stole it. I now use it. I'm, blessed. I'm blessed to get these wonderful introductions based on my history and accomplishments. Of course, the introduction doesn't include that I've been wonderful at getting married and terrible at staying married, and all of the other weaknesses and frailties that I have. So one of the things I do is I steal Bucky's line. But it's not just the sentence, it's really being grounded in that the most special thing about me is that I'm an average person. I'm just like you. So I think that kind of building rapport piece is important, and meaning it, not just as a speaking device, but really coming from that place when you are introduced, fortunately, with a very laudatory introduction. So that's something I do. I almost never tell a joke. I'm not good at it. I don't enjoy jokes that much personally. What I enjoy is funny people.
Right.
People, and so if I'm going to model anything, it's to allow any natural wit that I have to come forward. Are you familiar with Alan Parise?
I am not.
Alan's a fairly successful professional public speaker. His claim to fame that I remember is that he's supposedly the only person that the $1 Million Roundtable has ever invited twice. It's a big honor to be invited once, and to get asked for them to come ask you to come back is a big deal. But Alan is a fantastic public speaker because he's not scripted. I mean, he definitely has an outline that he follows, depending on the audience, and he has some tried and true one-liners, that work every time. But Alan happens to be 5 feet 5 inches tall. He's a tiny little guy, and I've only seen him twice in really doing his work, and in one of the times he got the big introduction, and he had them in advance leave the microphone stand up at the height of the introducer, which was, a solid 10 inches above his head. And he walked out on the stage carrying one of those plastic milk crates, the old-fashioned hard plastic crates for jugs of milk. And he just quietly walked out trailing with this thing hanging from his hand, and very carefully put it down in front of the microphone stand and climbed up on top of it to speak. He kind of dealt with his height in that way. And it just seemed so natural. The audience completely lost it. He hadn't said a word. He didn't say a word. No, I don't have any gimmicks like that, but I think that was a natural thing for Alan to do. He didn't tell a joke.
Instant connection, though.
Yes. And it's the thing everybody notices about him is he's so small. So
the elephant in the room, right? You might as well have fun with it and get it out of the way.
But it's that thing about being vulnerable and poking a little fun at yourself and being more natural. I believe I've read, and I believe it's true, that some exposure to improv is a great tool. I'm fortunate in that my best friend from high school days is a very gifted comic actor. And he turned me on to improv, where you learn to listen and flow and be more present on stage. And I think, almost every city has an improv class.
Right.
And they're very welcoming, is my experience. You think, well, I can't be funny like that. They don't care. You're fresh meat.
I've had 2 episodes where we talked about improv, and it's a natural. You're right. It's an absolute natural. And I think most people think we're going up there and just speaking, but you have to listen too. Even if you're the only one speaking, I believe you have to listen. You have to listen for those telltale signs of coughing, the rustling of papers, whatever it might be. But beyond that, you have to, quote unquote, listen to the atmosphere of that audience.
If a lot of people are picking up their mobile phones, it's not a good sign.
Yeah, it scares me when I speak now and they have that instant rating. They'll tell people to pick up their phones and rate or have questions up on the screens while you're speaking. And you see everybody on their phone, and I'm thinking, I wonder how many are actually doing that or are texting a friend or wife or coworker going, this sucks. It's like, and you see all these phones and you get a little nervous.
Checking sports scores.
Yeah.
There's a rock and roll band that I'm not really familiar with. I'm old, but my daughters are familiar with a band called Green Day.
Yeah.
And they sent me an interview with the guy behind Green Day. And I'm sorry, I don't remember his name. I'm so disconnected from my young people's music. But he was talking, they asked him about how he chose the songs, all original, for his latest CD. And his answer was amazing. It started out, he said something like, well, I'm looking for the flashes of light when we're touring. And I thought, what? What's that have to do with music? But in these big arenas, apparently, that Green Day was appearing in, they're darkened. The audience is darkened.
Sure.
So they discovered that if they play a song that people really like, it stays dark. If they play a song people kind of don't get, suddenly it becomes time to go check your phone or to go to the toilet or to grab a sandwich. And that means opening the doors at the back of these big arenas so you get a flash of light coming in. And that they were using that as feedback about which songs people really liked.
That's a great idea. It's a telltale sign.
But you're right. It's you can notice people nodding off. You can notice the telephone picking up the phone, I think, is one of the most popular ones, unfortunately, today. Or shuffling papers, or all those behaviors. It's like it's a pretty direct communication that you're not resonating. Either your material or the way you're presenting it's not resonating with your audience.
Someone told me years ago, listen for the coughs. He said, one cough is one thing. He said, but if people aren't in tune to you, it's almost like a yawn and it becomes contagious and everybody starts now, if anybody coughs, it's like my mind immediately goes, all right, how long before the second one? Is that acceptable or not?
It means something different today.
Yeah. Today you might hear a lot of them. When you're presenting, do you work from a script or an outline, or do you just have an idea and get up there and wing it?
Definitely from an outline or some key points. I remember when I was living in Japan, I was working through an interpreter 100% of the time at first. And I started realizing, I came back to the US for an industry meeting and I had trouble speaking. And I was waiting for the interpreter. So I went back to Tokyo and I thought I should do something about this. I'm not speaking really in English. So I joined an English-speaking Toastmasters club in Tokyo. And even though I'd had a lot of experience, I actually found it quite valuable. And I always remember that it was like, I don't know if it's their first rule, but it's the one I remember, which is first have something to say.
Yes.
Like really. And my learning is to kind of whittle that something to say down to a maximum of 3 points. And that's arbitrarily chosen. It could be 1 point. It probably would not be 5. I chose 3. That if you can get 3 ideas across to people in a talk, you're really accomplishing a lot. And to do that, you don't tell them everything you know. One of my great mentors, the founder of this company, Mind Dynamics, that led to the career that I've enjoyed for the past 40 years. Alexander said that in the trainings, you need to be teaching about 10% of what you know. That 90% is your backup. It's the deeper knowledge. But don't try to tell people 100% of what you know. You're going to fail. You're out on the edge.
You think of how many years it's taken you to learn that. You can't transfer that to someone else's mind in a short period of time.
Right. So I do discipline myself about having some very specific objectives, and they're limited. One of my learnings, frankly, from watching Alan Paris do his thing, is to pare down. The stories are so powerful in speaking, more powerful than really anything else, I think. But pare them down to their bones, get them down to be the minimum number of words, and stay focused on that story and its meaning. And don't assume that people know the meaning. They often miss the point. So find a gentle way to really make the point and drive it home. That's something I've learned that works.
I think that's important because we assume that if we tell a good story, everybody's going to get the meaning or the moral of the story. You never know who might misinterpret what you said, come up with a different meaning, who had something else on their mind for a moment and got lost. So I think that's right. If you tell them at some point that this is what this means, it really helps.
Yeah. And, I have a book that's become a bestseller. I'm proud of it. I'm proud of the journey to writing it and proud that people find value in it. But when I was first introducing the book, I really got clear that people miss the meaning quite often. And what's helpful is to come at that story from a different direction the second time or even the third time, that to get across a point that you believe is important. And that was particularly true in the PR tour, that follows the book to get the book marketed. You send the book, or your PR agency sends out the books to all these radio stations and TV stations and newspapers and so on. And somebody reads it. It's usually an intern or some grunt or a secretary. It's not the interviewer. And then they come up with 5 questions. And almost one of those questions is snarky. That's like a rule in these days. But what was interesting to me is how many people gravitated in terms of their questions to one sentence in the book. And that sentence being, "Life is simple. This does not mean it is easy." That idea that things are simple but not easy, I think really applies to public speaking. There's something that the apparency of it on the surface versus the deeper meaning potentially of what you're doing.
Robert, you've been a wealth of information. I really appreciate you being here with us today. And where can our listeners learn more about you?
Best way is through the website, extraordinarypeople.com, extraordinarypeople.com. I offer a free weekly e-zine that I've been doing for over 10 years, and several thousand people are enrolled. It's usually some idea, something that I've read, something that I've heard, and then a couple of comments about it, all designed to be read in 1 minute or less. It's called an Extraordinary Minute. That's once a week. And if you sign up for that, you also get a 28-page document about my work on experiential learning and being successful. Wander around on the website, you'll find all that stuff.
Robert, it's been a pleasure, and thanks so much for being here.
Peter, you're a delight. I love what you do and encourage people to reach out to you and get to be a better public speaker.
That's a wrap of another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tune in Monday when you'll hear another episode of Public Speaking with Peter George, and again Thursday for your next episode of Quick Bites, public speaking tips and techniques you can digest in 5 minutes or less. Until next time, remember, when it comes to speaking in public, you've got this.